Good morning, St. Andrews. Last week, Simon rang me and mentioned that we had a problem, that Alex Samuel couldn't make it this morning. So he said, Dan, you have two choices. Either you take Alex's place in the match so he can come and do the interview, or you speak at St. Andrews. It a long time, and then quickly made my decision to come here because you wouldn't want to see me play football. In the larger story of what was just read, we have a sub-story of a man who followed God with his whole heart. And buried in this story are truths about us as human beings that, when understood and engaged with, can literally turn your world upside down. I want to first show you, something about story before we enter into this one. The Bible is made up about 65% of stories, and 25% of poetry, and 10% of propositional truth. Propositional truth would be something like the statement, Jesus is the same yesterday, today, and forever, a verse in Hebrews. But most of the Bible is story. Now, why is that? Most research confirms this, and even some say it's more than 65%. But the way we are impacted in our lives is not typically by scientific facts or propositional truths. The way we're deeply impacted is often through stories. It's one way in which we can understand why films or movies or books and dramas are so engaging, because they really touch us quite deeply. Now, the way that we view the Bible often informs how we come to it and read it. And there are many different kinds of literature that some relate the Bible to. And so I'll give you some that I've experienced, I've heard it in others. So someone who thinks that the Bible is a sacred self-help book, how to be positive. Others might view the Bible as a sacred devotional book, what to read in your quiet times. I've heard the Bible described as a sacred motor manual that really helps you how to fix your life and keep it going. Or a sacred encyclopedia, knowledge about the Judeo-Christian history and religion. Many view the Bible type or genre as a sacred law book, knowing what's right and wrong, the rules to obey, and the consequences if you don't. And then still others, a sacred textbook, behaviors of the Christian life, and a study book in how to live that life. But over the last few years, I've begun to view the Bible as the sacred storybook, this drama that's being played out across the universe, and we have a place in it. And our little stories, each of ours, fits in to the bigger one. And so stories are these powerful means that God uses to touch us deeply. And the 500 plus stories in the Bible make up one big one, sometimes called a meta-narrative, that is the overarching reality of everything. It's a story that cries out for our rightful honor of the King of the universe and our allegiance to him. Each of us fits in this story. We each have a part to play, and we get to choose how that part plays out. You can't always choose where you were inserted into the story or all of the circumstances around you, but how your part plays out, you get to choose. And we see that in the story of Caleb in the middle of this bigger story of the 12 spies or scouts coming in to the land of Canaan, the promised land. So some people see this as a story of grasshoppers and giants. And you could see it as either the people of Israel are like grasshoppers in the land of giants, or in an upside down kind of way, you could see the giants are like grasshoppers in the eyes of God and of Caleb. We get to choose how we see. So here's the story again in summary. We read some of it here. Let's just put it again in its summary form. The Jewish people had just miraculously escaped 400 years of tyranny in Egypt, slavery, and they're on their way to this new country God had promised them, a new home, a new homeland, a land of freedom, flowing with good things and a good life. And so far, God had provided their direction, their protection, miraculous food and water. And now they're on the edge of this promised land, and Moses chooses 12 to go in and check it out. See what it's really like. We haven't seen it yet. They go in, and they come back with this amazing report. It is all of that land flowing with milk and honey that God mentioned to us. But there's a problem. It's also filled with giants. They're big, they're strong, they have fortified cities. There's no way we can go in and go into the land and take it like God promised. Well, at least that was most of the people. 2, Joshua and Caleb, say, no. It is a good land. And God told us we were supposed to go, and God is bigger than the things, the enemies, the giants that we see there. He will surely be with us, take their protection away, and we can have the victory that he promised. But the fear and disbelief of the majority prevailed. And God thought, here the people are rebelling against me, not wanting to do what I asked them to do, not wanting to receive the promises I gave them. So there's a consequence. So for the 40 days that the scouts were in the land checking it out, but came back refusing to do what I asked, I'll make 40 years of wandering in the desert for this people until this whole generation passes away. They won't be able to see the land I promised, except for Joshua and Caleb. They can go in. And the one part of this story that stands out for me is that when it describes Caleb, it describes him as someone with a different spirit. So what is different about him? What is this unique character that made him stand out among the crowd? Something that made God comment about him, get a place in Scripture like he did, and promise him a special inheritance. What was different about him? What was this different spirit? Now, before we go there, we're going to take a look at a couple of pictures, and it will help illustrate that we can see things differently, just like the Israelites saw something differently than what Caleb and Joshua saw. So those of you that are online, you can see right up here, I'm pointing to an imaginary box for all the rest of you, but they are seeing this picture right about here. What do you first see? Look again, and you might see another thing. And it might go back and forth. So how many of you saw the cup first? Okay, and how many saw the two faces first? Isn't it amazing that we can see the same thing, and some of us see one thing, some of us see another? And then even ourselves, we see one thing and we kind of either switch our view or focus, or something in our mind shifts and we see something else. Here's another one. Looks pretty normal at first, but count how many legs. This helps illustrate that we can see something that we think we know, and then it all of a sudden appears that there's some deception going on. Something's fooling us, and we're not seeing what we thought was there. Caleb's thinking was different than the rest, and it was about his perception of God, the world, and himself. Caleb had this root belief that God was good, that God wanted them to do this, to go in, that receiving this land was their destiny, part of God's big plan, that God would follow through with his promise, and that God could do this. When I grew up, my father used to tell me something and I often said this: I can't. I can't do the chore right, or I can't do it now, or I can't accomplish that. And my dad would tell me, Mr. Can't died in Russia. And so then, of course, I got the whole story. Where did he get that? He got it from his parents. His parents got it from their parents, who were in Russia. So my clan are called the Mennonites. And the Mennonites were a people that came out of the radical Reformation in the 1500s in Europe. And because of their particular beliefs, they were persecuted by the church, the national church. And so they had to flee to have any kind of freedom to worship the way they wanted to. And they went from Western Europe to Eastern Europe, and then from Eastern Europe they went into Russia, where they farmed land in the Ukraine. They stayed German-speaking, a form of German. They all lived together in community. They intermarried. Families of Mennonites would marry their children to families of Mennonites. They farmed well, and they stayed there for generations, farming the land, the breadbasket of the Ukraine. Well, until the Bolshevik Revolution. And then they had to flee again. And they had to leave their farms, their livestock, everything behind them. Everything they'd built up over generations, they had to leave behind. They couldn't take it with them. Some of them barely escaped through Siberia. Anyway, most of them ended up in either America, in Canada, or in South America. And when they left, and the children would ever say, "We can't," the parents would say to the children, "Mr. Can't, we're not going to be beholden by that thought that what we had was the best. What we had was our destiny. But know what was in front of us. And whatever it takes, we're going to go for it. And we're going to rebuild. And we're going to stick together. And we're going to love each other. And we're going to make it." So Mr. Can't died in Russia. And that's what Caleb was thinking. That when the others would say, "We can't go in there. We can't face those giants." What is he remembering? He's remembering everything until then in his history, his journey with his people, that God had done for them. Delivered them miraculously out of Egypt. Remember the dividing of the Red Sea. They've been led by fire and cloud. He'd literally provided for them food from heaven and water from rocks. So he fully believed that if the Lord is pleased with us, He will bring us into this land. The protection of the people, the giants, will have been removed. The Lord is with us." And so Moses, Joshua, and Caleb viewed the acts of God as a father carrying his son, finding places to camp, protecting and loving them. And here's how it's recorded in Deuteronomy 1. "The Lord your God, who goes before you, will fight for you, just as you saw him do in Egypt and in the wilderness, where the Lord your God carried you, as a man carries his son, all the way by which you traveled, until you reached this place." That's how they saw the work of God, how he'd led so far, what he'd done for them. But the rest of the people, they had a different view. They thought that God hated them, that God had a devious plan to deliver to their enemies, not from their enemies, and that he couldn't follow through on his promises. Again in Deuteronomy, "Because the Lord hates us, he has brought us out of the land of Egypt to deliver us into the hand of the enemy to destroy us." Same information, same data, same history, two different ways of looking. And it was his choice. It was their choice. And we have those choices to perceive, to think about God in a certain way. And it'll affect everything in our lives and can turn it truly upside down. Now, sometimes the way we perceive the world is how we were raised or where, perhaps, we lived. When I was in Morocco, I remember a very startling realization when I showed the Jesus film to one of my friends. Many of you have seen the Jesus film. It's his whole life set in a Middle Eastern setting and gives the highlights of Jesus' teaching, his relationship with the disciples, his death, and resurrection. And when we got through the film, my friend, who was a pretty simple man, very poor, lived in a small village, said to me, "That was an amazing movie. Did you see all the green grass?" I said, "What green grass?" And then he pointed to that one scene where the disciples and Jesus were walking along from village to village, and it happened to be through what looked like a stream, but the stream had lots of little tributaries. And so it looked like they were walking almost through water. Everything was green, there were trees around them, and that's what his main recollection of the film was about. Why? Well, he didn't have running water. He lived in a place where they had to go several hundred meters to get water from the well every day. He lived in a place where there was only a few inches of rainfall a year. He lived in a place where if the rain didn't come, you didn't have bread to eat. And so when he saw that, he saw the promised land. He saw a land flowing with milk and honey. He saw a land that was perfect for a good life. I'll share another example of how we perceive things in my parenting. I was with my sons. We have two sons, and we were on an expedition in the wilderness of Utah. We were canoeing a wild river. There were 6 of us in 3 canoes. And if you know about rapids and wild rivers, you understand why people do them in kayaks that have, quite they hold you in and don't let much water into the boat. Or rubber rafts, because rubber rafts can do all kinds of things in the rapids, and they're big enough, and they usually don't turn over or get filled with water. Most people don't do them in canoes. And we found out why. Because in rapids, in canoes, which is just ready to take on the waves and the high water, you go down really quickly. And we did a lot. And so there were 6 of us, but 2 of the men actually found it too tough. And when we had a chance to pull out, they pulled out of the expedition. So it was my 2 sons, myself, and my friend. They were in one canoe, my friend and I were in the other. And we'd just been through this really rough rapid, and I found myself continually looking over my shoulder to see if they were okay. We got to the end, we got through it actually, through that one, without capsizing, without being thrown out of the canoe, and they made it as well and came alongside of us. And I exclaimed to them how glad I was that they made it, and I'd been wondering how they would do. And they looked at me, they said, "Dad, what are you worried about us for? We were thinking you wouldn't make it." And you know, it finally dawned on me, the boys are in their 20s already, and it occurred to me at that time how I was still looking at them. I was still looking at them as the little boys, the ones that I had to protect, that I had to worry about, the ones that didn't have the experience, that weren't as strong as me, that maybe wouldn't be able to do it without me. They were young men in their 20s, alive with strength, with hope, didn't have concerns about the water. They preferred going in. And they were looking at me as a guy who's starting to get a little bit old, more frail, not sure he always makes the best decisions all the time. In fact, we've seen him go in plenty of times today in the rapids. We're not concerned about ourselves. We're concerned about you, Dad. And it was a switch in my mind from the perception of who I used to be as the father of little boys, and now who I was as almost more of a, in some ways, kind of an equal with growing young men. So we have these perceptions in our lives, and sometimes we need those kind of wake-up calls to become aware of our perceptions, our view of things, how we're looking at the world. And it's then, when we have that wake-up call, that realization of how we are looking at things, how we perceive God and ourselves, that we can choose to change again. So we're not merely at the mercy of our circumstances. We can make these choices of how we play our part in God's story. We choose the perceptions and narratives and root beliefs every day. And if upon reflection we think we've been viewing things wrongly, we can choose to change them. I had an experience once with a leader that became one of my big life lessons. I had just gone through a traumatic experience with my team that meant people ended up leaving and accusing us of certain actions. And it was so troubling, I wondered if we would stay in our job where we were. We thought to quit. In fact, we almost did. So in that moment, I called my leader, my supervisor, and I explained to him what happened. And I thought he was going to be wanting to know more information, listening intently, giving me some empathy, maybe giving me some advice, helping me through this. I just felt alone. Well, basically he said, "Oh, that's too bad." And we had a very short conversation, and it was over. And I walked away just feeling so low, so alone, so abandoned. I held that against him for years, just inside myself, mostly, except Christine. She heard a lot about it, because whenever it came up, he was still my leader. Whenever he would come up or a situation would come up, she could hear me complaining about what kind of leader he was, how he made a certain decision. It went on for quite some time. It was embarrassingly long, how I held that grudge against him, how I held that resentment inside me. And I can't remember exactly how, but one day, God helped me see, and I realized, Dan, that's not his problem anymore. That's become your problem. That's become your sin. You have to do something about it. It's not up to him anymore. And I realized, yeah, that's absolutely right. So I actually waited until the next time I saw him. I went up to him and I said, you know when such and such happened? He'd forgotten completely about it. He wasn't living with that problem all those years. I was. I said, well, I held that against you. And I want to ask your forgiveness for doing that, for being bitter and not loving you and not thinking the best of you for this whole time. And he says, okay. You know, I was thinking maybe there'd be a little bit more depth to this, but you know, maybe you've heard stories like these, or maybe you've experienced it. I literally felt a weight off of my shoulders. Something lifted, something disappeared, and I wasn't dealing with it anymore. And my attitude towards him completely changed. We became really good friends. He stayed my leader for years on from then, and I would go to him for advice. He would come to me for advice, completely changed the relationship. But again, it was a perception that I had, that I held on to. It was a circumstance that I thought I couldn't do anything about until God showed me. And when he did, and I saw it differently, I perceived him, the leader, the situation, and what I could do about it differently, took some action. It turned my world upside down. And we have that experience, or that possibility to do as well. So Caleb chose to remember that God was good. He was big enough. He chose to remember that his God had already come through with wonder-working power. He chose to believe that God could do it again. He chose not to be a victim of his hurt or his status or his lot in life. And then remember Peter, when he had his eyes on Jesus first, which allowed him to walk on water. And then when he switched his view to the waves, everything changed. You know, through no fault of his own, Caleb had to walk for 40 years in the wilderness. Who did he walk with? All the people whose fault it was. It wasn't his fault. Can you imagine what he was tempted to think every morning of those 40 years? He probably had a tent right next to one of the other 10 scouts or spies. So there's Jethro. There's Jethro over there. Why didn't he see God like I did? Why did he have to give that bad report to the people? Why did he have to make their hearts melt? Jethro gets up and, he's seeing him every day. And there's another guy camped on the other side of him, one of the other 10. And he had to live with them, walk with them through the desert for 40 years. And it wasn't his problem. It was all everyone else's issue and fault. But imagine what attitude he must have had. That could have been tempting, but he couldn't have felt that way for 40 years and come out like he did at the other end. Because here's what he said. Now then, so it's all over, and the 40 years are ended. He and Joshua are ready to go into that promised land that God had given them. And he says, now then, just as the Lord promised, he has kept me alive 45 years since the time he promised Moses, while Israel moved about in the wilderness. So here I am today, 85 years old. I am still as strong today as the day Moses sent me out. I'm just as vigorous to go out to battle now as I was then. Now give me this hill country that the Lord promised me that day. You yourself heard that the giants, the Anakites, were there, and their cities were large and fortified, but the Lord helping me, I will drive them out, just as he said. In another part of Scripture, we find that 45 years after those guys had gone in and been afraid of the giants, Caleb at 85, with his sons and the sons of his friends, not his old friends, went in and they drove out those giants from the land. They didn't disappear. They didn't die on their own. Caleb was still able to follow through with everything God had said, including that. We remember another verse in New Testament, where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. Caleb was wholehearted towards God, followed him fully. And that's where he'd put all his hope and treasure, in God. And it's our choice today to do the same. Here's a definition of wholehearted for me. All of your heart invested in all of God's story. And we need to remember what the big story is. So where are you in this one? Are you similar to Caleb today, or to Moses, or maybe more like the people of Israel? One way to know is think about what we are dreading of, what we're dreading. What are we afraid of today? What are we anxious about? What are we maybe grumbling about? We can acknowledge it, and we can choose to move to a different place in the story, have a different view, have a different spirit, like Caleb. And we choose that every day. So remembering the big meta-narrative of God, that we're a kingdom of priests, like the people of Israel were supposed to be, going into the land to be God's ambassadors, messengers of his love and his ways. And this fits with the initial intent of God revealed in Genesis when he said, be fruitful, multiply in all of the earth. What were they supposed to multiply, Adam and Eve? Little baby humanoids? Well, that was part of it, but those little babies filled with the knowledge that they were created in God's image, filled with love of God, filled with whole hearts following God. That's what Adam and Eve and mankind was supposed to reproduce in Genesis. And we can reproduce people in the very image of God in which they were created by making disciples, by being wholehearted followers of Jesus today. And we, as wholehearted followers of Jesus, and the ones that we influence through our life and ministry, will be the ones that inherit the new promised land, the new heavens and new earth that's promised at the end of the God story in Revelations. So this is what the Lord is looking at today. 2 Chronicles says, for the eyes of the Lord move to and fro throughout the earth, that he may strongly support those whose hearts are completely his. That's our choice today. Again, to choose how we interpret the things around us in the world. To choose how we perceive God. Same information, same data, you choose how you see him today, how you see your place in the story. So where are you in the story today? You can choose. We can choose. Let's choose to be wholehearted like Caleb, following after God.